20% of the world's oil, one narrow strait, and a strategy that just handed Beijing the keys to the global energy system. That's not hyperbole. That's the operational reality of what's unfolding in the Persian Gulf right now, and almost no one in mainstream American media is willing to say it plainly. The Trump administration has spent months tightening the screws on Iran through what officials call a maximum pressure campaign in the Strait of Hormuz, complete with naval deployments, sanctions enforcement, and threats of military action. The stated goal: force Tehran to the negotiating table on nuclear terms favorable to Washington and Tel Aviv. The actual outcome, something entirely different and far more dangerous to American economic interests than anyone in the West Wing seems prepared to admit. Gas prices at American pumps have climbed roughly 140 per gallon since the pressure campaign intensified. Diesel, the fuel that moves every truck delivering every product to every store in the country, has risen even faster. Insurance premiums for tankers transiting Hormuz have tripled. Shipping companies are rerouting. And the Chinese yuan, for the first time in modern history, is being seriously discussed as the settlement currency for crude moving out of the Gulf. This channel runs on no corporate funding, no government backing, and no advertising pressure telling us what to leave out. If you want the analysis that mainstream outlets won't touch, the kind that follows the money instead of the talking points, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The next phase of this story is going to move fast, and you'll want to be there when it does. Now let's get into what actually happened, because the official narrative and the operational reality are telling two completely different stories. The administration's Hormuz strategy was built on a single assumption: that economic and military pressure on Iran would force Tehran to capitulate before the global energy market noticed. That assumption is now in pieces. Iranian oil exports, which Washington promised to drive to zero, are running at roughly 1.6 million barrels per day, according to tanker tracking data from independent maritime analytics firms. Almost every barrel of that is heading east, not to refineries that fear American sanctions, to refineries that have decided American sanctions no longer apply to them. Here's what the administration won't tell you about how that happened. When the United States threatened secondary sanctions on any entity buying Iranian crude, the assumption in Washington was that fear of being cut off from the dollar system would do the enforcement work. For 2 decades, that assumption held. The dollar was the only game in town for international energy trade, and the threat of being denied access to it was enough to make even reluctant partners comply. That era is now ending in real time, and Hormuz is where it's ending. China is buying Iranian oil openly, not through shell companies, not through ship-to-ship transfers in the dark, openly. State-owned Chinese refiners, the so-called teapot refineries in Shandong province, are taking delivery at discounted prices and settling in yuan. The discount, depending on the week, runs between $4 and $8 per barrel below Brent. That discount is the price Iran pays for sanctions evasion. It's also the subsidy China receives for breaking the dollar's monopoly on energy settlement. Read that again slowly. The United States imposed sanctions designed to bankrupt Iran. Those sanctions are now bankrolling China's strategic effort to displace the dollar. The official narrative says American pressure is working because Iranian oil revenue is reduced. The operational reality shows that Iranian oil revenue is flowing, just on terms that strengthen Beijing and weaken Washington simultaneously. Defense and energy analysts familiar with the trade flows describe a structural shift that did not exist 3 years ago and that may be irreversible within 5. Now, here's the technical breakdown that almost nobody is discussing. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point. The shipping lane itself, the actual navigable channel for fully laden supertankers, is 2 miles wide in each direction. That's it. 2 miles. A vessel of war could close that channel in under an hour with the weapon systems Iran has already publicly demonstrated: anti-ship ballistic missiles with terminal guidance, naval mines of multiple generations, some of them effectively undetectable until they detonate, fast attack craft operating in swarms designed specifically for asymmetric engagement against larger surface combatants, a coastline of mountainous terrain that provides launch positions American satellites cannot fully cover in real time. The United States Navy maintains carrier strike group presence in the region precisely to deter what Iran could do in that 2 mile channel. The cost of that presence runs into the billions per year. The carrier itself, the air wing, the destroyers and cruisers that escort it, the submarines that operate in support, the logistical tail that keeps everything fueled and supplied, all of it exists for one operational purpose, which is to make Iran calculate that closing Hormuz would bring consequences worse than whatever provoked the closure. Here's the dimension the Pentagon would prefer you didn't think about. That deterrent works only as long as Iran believes the United States is willing to absorb the cost of escalation. The moment Tehran calculates that Washington has more to lose from a Hormuz closure than Iran does, the deterrent collapses. And that calculation is shifting. Consider the numbers. A full closure of Hormuz, even for 30 days, would push global oil prices toward $200 per barrel, according to multiple independent energy market analyses. American gasoline prices would clear $7 per gallon nationally, with coastal states seeing 8 or 9. Inflation, which the Federal Reserve has spent 3 years trying to control, would reaccelerate immediately. The political consequences for any sitting administration would be devastating. Iran's calculation is different. Iran already exists under the most severe sanctions regime any major economy has faced in modern history. The marginal damage from a Hormuz closure to a country already cut off from most of the Western financial system is meaningfully smaller than the marginal damage to the country imposing the sanctions. That asymmetry is the entire strategic problem with the current approach. The pressure campaign assumes Iran has more to lose. The actual ledger shows the opposite. Let's do the math on the asymmetry because this is where the strategy falls apart on contact with reality. The United States economy generates roughly $28 trillion in annual output. A sustained oil price shock of the magnitude a Hormuz closure would produce conservatively reduces that output by 1.5 to 2% over the following 12 months. That's somewhere between $400 and $500 billion in lost American economic activity from a single 30-day disruption. Iran's total annual economic output is roughly $400 billion. The entire Iranian economy in a year equals what a Hormuz crisis would cost the American economy in lost growth alone. That's before counting emergency strategic petroleum reserve releases, before counting military operational costs of forcing the Strait back open, before counting the political cost of explaining to American voters why the country went into recession over a confrontation most of them never asked for. One side risks roughly 100% of its economic output by escalating. The other side risks somewhere around 2%. That ratio determines who blinks first, and it does not favor Washington. The math is brutal, and no amount of carrier deployments changes the underlying equation. Now consider what China is doing while that asymmetry plays out. Beijing is buying every barrel of discounted Iranian crude it can move. It's filling its strategic petroleum reserves at prices Western refiners cannot access. It's settling those purchases in yuan, building the financial plumbing that makes a non-dollar oil market structurally possible for the first time since the 1970s. And it's doing all of this while letting the United States Navy bear the cost of keeping Hormuz open. Think about what that means operationally. American sailors are deployed in harm's way, on ships costing billions of dollars to operate, providing the security that allows Chinese refiners to import oil they're paying for in a currency designed to displace the dollar. The United States is, in effect, subsidizing the construction of the alternative financial system that will eventually reduce its own global leverage. Defense analysts will study this arrangement for decades, and they will not be kind in their assessments. The Russia angle compounds everything. Moscow has been building parallel financial infrastructure with Beijing since the 2022 sanctions on Russian energy exports. The two countries now settle the majority of their bilateral trade outside the dollar system. Russian crude flows to China, Indian refiners arbitrage that crude into product exports, and the dollar system loses transaction volume month after month. Iran joining that arrangement formally rather than informally completes the energy triangle that connects the three largest sanctioned oil exporters into a coherent non-dollar bloc. Russian officials are watching the Hormuz situation with what one European analyst described as quiet professional satisfaction. Every additional dollar of pressure Washington applies to Tehran pushes Iran further into the arrangement Russia has spent 3 years building. Moscow gains without spending a ruble, without firing a shot, without taking any risk at all. The American pressure campaign is, from Moscow's perspective, the most effective form of Russian foreign policy currently being executed anywhere in the world, and it's being executed by Americans. Here's what the most honest energy market analysis will tell you about the medium-term trajectory. A UN-denominated oil benchmark settled through Chinese clearing infrastructure and backed by physical delivery from Iran, Russia, and potentially Venezuela becomes operationally viable within roughly 18 months at current trajectories. Once that benchmark exists and demonstrates reliability, Gulf producers, including Saudi Arabia, will be forced to accept partial yuan settlement for the portion of their exports going to Asian refiners. That's not speculation. That's the public negotiating position Saudi Arabia has already telegraphed in multiple high level meetings, and it represents the single largest potential erosion of dollar dominance since the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971. The United States has spent 50 years building a global financial architecture in which the dollar's role as the settlement currency for energy provided a structural subsidy worth somewhere between $200 and $400 billion per year in lower borrowing costs, deeper capital markets, and unmatched economic leverage. The current Hormuz strategy is accelerating the dismantling of that architecture in exchange for short term tactical pressure on a regional adversary that the administration has not actually defeated. That's the trade. Read it again. Long-term structural advantage in exchange for short-term tactical theater. No serious strategist would make that exchange voluntarily, which raises an uncomfortable question about whether anyone running the current policy actually understands what they're trading away. Now let's talk about what happens next because the timeline matters and most American viewers have not been told what to watch for. Three predictions with clocks attached. First, within 90 days, expect a serious incident in or around the Strait of Hormuz involving either a tanker, a naval vessel, or both. The probability of a clean diplomatic resolution to the current standoff is low. The probability of a controlled escalation that the administration uses to justify additional military deployment is meaningfully higher. Watch for unusual tanker insurance rate spikes as the leading indicator. The shipping industry knows things before the news cycle does. Second, within 6 months, at least one Gulf Cooperation Council state will publicly accept partial yuan settlement for oil exports to a major Asian buyer. The most likely candidate is the United Arab Emirates, which has been quietly building yuan clearing infrastructure for 2 years. Once one Gulf state breaks the dollar only convention publicly, the others will follow within 12 to 18 months because the competitive disadvantage of maintaining dollar only pricing becomes commercially unsustainable. Third, within 12 months, American gasoline prices will average above $5 per gallon nationally, with seasonal peaks above 6. The combination of strategic petroleum reserve depletion, refinery maintenance cycles, and sustained Hormuz tension makes this nearly arithmetic. The political consequences of that price level, in an electoral environment already strained, will reshape the conversation about whether the current Iran strategy is worth its actual cost. The pressure campaign will likely be quietly abandoned, but the structural damage to dollar dominance will already be done. You cannot reverse a regime change in global oil settlement by canceling the policy that triggered it. What burns in this strategy is not just American credibility in the Gulf. It's the foundational assumption that the dollar's role in energy markets is permanent and unchallengeable. That assumption underwrote American economic power for 2 generations. The Trump administration's Hormuz approach is testing it harder than it has ever been tested, and the early results are not what Washington promised. The mainstream coverage of this story focuses on military deployments, diplomatic statements, and Iranian threats. Those are the visible surface. The actual story is happening in the settlement systems, the tanker manifests, the discount spreads, and the quiet conversations in Beijing, Moscow, and Riyadh about what comes after the dollar's monopoly ends. That story is being told here on this channel because it is not being told in the places most Americans get their news. Here's the question for the comments, and consider it seriously before you answer. Which happens first? A major Hormuz incident that forces direct American military action, a Gulf state publicly accepting yuan settlement for oil, or American gas prices clearing $5 per gallon nationally? Drop your prediction below with your reasoning. Every comment gets read, and the best analyses will get featured in the follow-up video. If this gave you a framework that mainstream coverage didn't, a way to see the actual stakes underneath the daily headlines, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really being traded away in the Persian Gulf right now. The next video goes deeper into the yuan settlement infrastructure that Beijing has been building and how close it actually is to operational readiness. The numbers will surprise you. Subscribe so you're there when it lands.